shouldn't. I usually travel with one. Let me turn this off while you talk.
Okay. 1, 2, 3. And that's okay. Okay, welcome everybody, and to those who are watching on the streams, welcome too, wherever you are. Let's offer a prayer, and then I'll introduce our speaker. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Almighty God, give us gratitude for all your gifts in all areas of our lives, and inspire us with generosity to imitate your goodness and return to you by giving to those around us. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. My pleasure to introduce Mr. Scott Bader. He works for the Archdiocese of Seattle. He is involved in helping parishes manage their financial situations, but for many years before that he was Director of Stewardship for the Archdiocese. He's also been on the International Catholic Stewardship Conference Board for some years. And on the diocesan website, which is PG Diocese, there is a link to the ICSC with all kinds of free resources that any parish can use to promote the vision and the practice of stewardship in its own community. So welcome, Scott, and thank you for being with us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bishop. Let's see. We're working? Good, good. Okay, first piece of good news, there's no special collection. There's not even a first collection. So, anyway, I'm grateful to be here, and it's been a journey in stewardship for me, both personally and professionally. I'll share some of that as I go through my presentation. So the first presentation this evening, I want to focus on kind of the broader aspects of stewardship and what it means to us personally, our call to stewardship, and to give you some kind of common understanding, I think, of what the church means when we are talking about that word stewardship. So we'll do that. Hopefully, if you came in, you got a copy of the handout there. I'll do a PowerPoint, but I'm pretty sparse on it, so I'm not reading from the screen. You'll want to take notes if you have a pen handy. If not, get some. Hopefully, that'll get you into some active listening as well. So real quick, my journey to stewardship started with my parish business manager, who one time out of the blue called me and told me she wanted me to come with a group of other parishioners to what we were then calling sacrificial giving training sessions. And so I went to this training session one evening. I was like, oh, another meeting to go to in the evening, or we want to stay home. But I went and heard this dynamic presentation that went on twice as long as it was scheduled for, from a great presenter who overloaded us with like a pile of handouts that were, probably 1.5 inches high. But it was dynamic and it was exciting because it created for many of us a vision for how we could help the church do more and help our Catholic people grow closer to God through stewardship and focusing on the message of stewardship. So as we go forward here then, I want to cover 4 sections here in this first presentation. First of all, kind of why stewardship. Then second, obstacles to stewardship. Third, what is stewardship? And then kind of talk, leading into the next presentation, how to kind of look at stewardship as a structurally and think about it kind of cohesively in terms of how do we live it and how do our parishes live it out. So anyhow, we'll go that route. And let's see here if the remote is on. So we'll go to our first slide here. And the first thing I want to talk about in terms of stewardship is that it was, when we get right down to stewardship, it's not new. We hear the word, and I think to a lot of people go, oh, another new program from the church. But the reality is if we look at the message of stewardship, which involves things like charity, taking care of the things that God has given us, gratitude, returning those gifts. Those, of course, all go back to the Gospels, if not before, into the Old Testament. So we may be talking about it more now. We may have kind of assembled it into more coherent theology, but nothing in stewardship is new to the Catholic Church, nothing new to our faith. And so as people talk about stewardship, I think we need to keep that in mind, that it's something we've always been about as church. Somebody famously said that stewardship is everything we do after I say, I believe. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. It may be a little bit of an overstatement, but once we say I believe, the way we live out our lives, how we use the gifts God has given us, our life, is really constructed around what kind of stewards are we of what God has given us. So it's nothing that's been new to our church. There are two documents that I want to refer you to and have you consider looking at if you haven't before. And there are some other documents out there you could look at as well. But the first is the U.S. Bishop's Pastoral Letter on Stewardship. And it's a fantastic document. It was written back in 1992, so this November will actually be the 25th anniversary of when it was approved by the U.S. bishops. I had the good fortune to work for the bishop that was the head of the committee, Archbishop Thomas Murphy, who was Archbishop of Seattle in the early 90s, in the mid-90s, and you can certainly see his spirit shining through it, but it's a fantastic document that I think kind of helps us to bring this whole message of stewardship together and is a good touchstone for that. The second one that I found helpful was written probably the better part of 20 years ago now, or at least a decade and a half ago, by was Archbishop Collins. Is he now Cardinal Collins? Cardinal Collins, when he was Archbishop of Edmonton. I think this is still on the Archdiocesan website in Edmonton, and a great summary and approach to what the message of stewardship is. So these two documents I think are very useful, and I would recommend them to you, that you take a look at those documents and read through them. You can read through either one of them in half an hour to an hour, probably best digested in chapters and small parts, but I think you really get the spirit of stewardship by looking at those pastoral letters. So if stewardship is nothing new, why are we now emphasizing this whole message of stewardship? And I think there are a couple of important reasons for that, and you probably recognize them as well. So I think a big part of it stems from our experience as church here in Canada and the United States. I mean, we were churches composed of immigrants, mostly poor immigrants, who came to North America, and we didn't have a lot, our ancestors didn't have a lot of discretionary income or discretionary time. They mostly worked at, menial jobs, and were just trying to get by, and the church was just trying to get by. However, since World War II, who we are as church has largely been transformed. Not that there aren't still Catholics of modest or very impoverished means, but by and large, we as Catholics have become well off with at least a fair amount of discretionary income and discretionary time. Catholics in the U.S. and Canada usually have incomes that are higher than the average for our nations as a whole. And so I think because of that, there was a concern on the part of the bishops that we were still living, in many ways, the experience of immigrants in terms of our approach to supporting the church, but the reality is that we were no longer, by and large, people of modest means, but people of relative affluence. And so I think that was one motivation. That it was an attempt to call Catholics to begin to think more deeply about how they are using what the gifts that God has given them, because because they had so many more discretionary gifts of time and money than they had before. A couple of themes that I see running through stewardship. And the first one is about dependence on God. I think that's connected somewhat to our relative affluence, that as we become more affluent, it's become easier for us not to realize or to be constantly aware of our dependence on God. We live in cultures, especially I think in the Western Canada and the Western United States, where independence is a highly prized virtue. But we know as Catholics that we may think of ourselves as independent, but we're really dependent on God for everything we have and everything we are. But it's something we've got to constantly be reminded of and remember. Otherwise, we tend to just think that we're responsible for our success, when in reality we know God is. And we may intellectually acknowledge that, but it's challenging to, I think, live that on a regular basis. And pastoral letters on stewardship, this whole message of stewardship is calling us to be regularly mindful of our dependence on God. It may be some pop psychology, but I think one reason why the church in the third world is so strong is because our fellow Catholics in the third world live day in and day out that reality, that dependence on God. Another thing I think we can see this is, I was at a conference last week, the Diocesan Fiscal Managers Conference, and this organization called CARA, the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate, put up a nice chart of mass attendance on the screen for the last 20-25 years. And it was a pretty constant rate of about 20-25% of Catholics, at least in the U.S., attending Mass every week. Except there was one blip in that, where it went up to about 30 or over 30% for a couple of months. Anybody want to guess what that was, when that occurred? 9/11, exactly. And I think that was because all of a sudden people really understood and took to heart, at least for a few weeks, that we aren't in control of our lives. And so I think that experience drove an increase in mass attendance, and I think that connected to that idea that, again, we're not independent, we're dependent on God for everything we have and are. And I suspect there was probably another blip around it's been over a decade now, that the tsunami at the end of 2004, again, the devastation that occurred there, I think people took that to heart for a brief period of time. So unfortunately, it was only for a brief period of time. And those of us that do go to Mass every week, I think we can be grateful for the fact that we are there and have that better sense of dependence. But I think we see how that is really that lack of realizing how dependent we are on God has really affected our ability to be good stewards. So I think stewardship is an attempt to reawaken that awareness of our dependence on God. The second theme I think that runs through stewardship is that stewardship should influence our decision-making as Catholics. And this really comes home when we think about that if God is the source of all the gifts we have, of our time and our money, shouldn't God and our faith influence how we're using those gifts of time and money that we've been given, or time and resources? But I would suspect for most Catholics, we rarely stop and give a thought about, what kind of car or house is God calling me to buy? What decisions is God calling me to make about my free time? Those of us in this room and you listening remotely probably do that on a regular basis. But we as a church, through this message of stewardship, I think need to help people connect to this reality that God and our faith need to be part of the decisions we make all the time about how we use the resources that we have at our disposal. And so hopefully stewardship can help us connect with that message as well. And not just our big decisions we might have, like buying a house, but even, but even small ones. So there are smaller ones, buying a car, buying, how much do we buy when we stop at Costco? Obviously very tempting to wander into Costco if you're like me and blow your budget. I always tell my wife when we're going in, okay, $200, that's all we're spending this time at Costco. And of course, it always kind of creeps up a little because we see something there that we hadn't planned on buying. But I think that discipline of, okay, thinking about what is God calling us to buy or to do with the resources we have. The third theme that I think runs through stewardship is that stewardship gives meaning to our lives. And I think this is a message that we can especially use to help stewardship resonate with young people who are searching for what to do with their lives. If God is the source of all our gifts, including our lives, how we use that is a crucial decision for what we make, for what we do. And stewardship provides that powerful answer that our lives are supposed to be focused on using those gifts to build up the kingdom. And so if we see everything we have as a gift from God, focusing our lives on doing that is that answer to what meaning do our lives have. But I think that also is connected to that secular world of stewardship. We hear the word stewardship bantered around a fair amount. The environmental community will certainly use it, not wrongly. Certainly the call to be good stewards of the gift of the environment that God has given us is important. I've seen colleges use it, but I think the important thing that separates our understanding of the word stewardship from the way the rest of the world uses it is we know our stewardship is driven by the recognition that everything we have comes from God. And so if we put that at the core of our understanding of stewardship, that I think will drive more meaning in our lives as well. So stewardship, some important themes, an important way to live our lives, whether it's decision making, what meaning we have in our lives, our dependence on God. But we also have to recognize that there are obstacles to stewardship, and there are several of those. The first obstacle to stewardship, and I think this is important for us, I suspect all of us here are parish leaders, whether we're here in person or attending online, but we need to recognize those obstacles because it can easily, if we don't recognize that there are obstacles, it can discourage us personally from living lives of stewardship and also discourage us as parish leaders as we try to get this message out to our fellow Catholics as well. And the first obstacle, I think, is ignorance. Ignorance about the fact that all of us are called to be stewards. Ignorance about the fact that there are responsibilities that arise out of stewardship, to be grateful, to cultivate our gifts, to share our gifts. We'll talk about those more. And also ignorance of the difficulties of being stewards, and how challenging that can be. My example of going to Costco and blowing or going beyond that budget we plan is a good example of how those difficulties constantly get in our way. And so I think we need to be aware that there's this ignorance out there of what the call to stewardship is and the difficulties of being good stewards. The second obstacle, and this might sound more familiar, is self-centeredness. That self-centeredness, I think, it's just natural. It's human nature for us to want to be self-centered, and stewardship in our faith calls us to move beyond that. But it's certainly an obstacle, right? Because I think there's always a temptation to go back and be self-centered. So the first thing I think in terms of that self-centeredness that wants us to focus on ourselves and our pleasures are, of course, the distractions of the comfortable lifestyle that most of us lead. We may not be living in mansions, and we may not be we may not have our needs catered to like Hollywood movie stars do, but we do have relatively comfortable lifestyles that can draw us away from God. Everything in the media, TV, social media, all that can easily distract us from God and our faith and the call to be stewards. And then even beyond that, addictions, not even just the things we think of as classical addictions like drugs or alcohol, but addictions to things like food and spending and that kind of thing being a steward calls us to live a balanced lifestyle, but it's hard to counter that self-centeredness. So we need to be aware that self-centeredness is an obstacle to stewardship for us. The next obstacle is related to that, but I think, I term it materialism, but I think it's more of an obstacle looking out ahead of us. The desire for more possessions. What more can we have now? And of course, I think, again, it's human nature to want more. Sometimes, clearly it's the devil, I think, pulling us to desire more, but wanting more, bigger stuff. But that desire for possessions is a big part of materialism. The desire for more power, and it isn't just, say political power, but power in many areas of our lives, whether it's at work, with our coworkers, even the power that we want to have on the road, so we want to be the ones to get where we want to go first. So that greater status that we desire, and I think you can see that a lot on social media, people wanting more status and more attention from that. And then also the desire for prestige, for more prestige, to be thought of as better. Again, I think all things that kind of stem out of materialism, the desire to have more than we have now. So I think that's an important obstacle we have to recognize, because it's one we have to combat. And I think by calling people to be better stewards, that they can help to combat those obstacles. So we've talked about kind of the idea of stewardship and what can get in the way, but now let's maybe backtrack a little bit to talk about what is stewardship. And it's intriguing that in the U.S. Bishop's pastoral letter on stewardship, in the actual pastoral letter itself, they never actually give a definition of what stewardship is. They talk about the attributes of stewardship, but it isn't until the appendix of the pastoral letter that they talk about what is or who is a Christian steward. And so finally in the appendix we get this definition of what does a Christian steward look like. And so I think that's a good place for us to start about how to define what stewardship is. And in the pastoral letter, it says, in the appendix, it says that stewards receive God's gifts gratefully, they cultivate them responsibly, they share them lovingly and in justice with others, and return them with increase to the Lord. And so we'll talk about these here in detail here in just a minute, but it's but that's the image of who a steward is, and I'm sure you can all think of what of people that live and look like this. And so let's go into some detail on those, and also try to talk about how do those connect with what you do in your personal life to be a better steward, and how we can help our fellow parishioners be better stewards as well. So, and this is the construct that I see. So, so for the first aspect of stewardship, we receive God's gifts gratefully. I kind of connect that with prayer, because how do we express our gratitude to God for the gifts we received? Through prayer in a large way. And that need to do that through several aspects. We need to create awareness amongst our people, again, that God is the source of our gifts, and thank God for those gifts. Obviously, our liturgy and worship are structured to frequently remind us of how God has been so generous to us. I mean, the whole understanding of the meaning of the word Eucharist is thanksgiving. The fact that throughout Mass, we regularly thank God for what God has given us. Part of this, though, is also that we have to make sure that we help people to give God thanks for gifts both big and small. I mean, I think it's easy for us to thank God for really big gifts. When we get that promotion we were after, when a child or grandchild is born, when someone close to us passes away, and we realize what a fantastic life they've led and what they've given to us. But we're also called to remember to be grateful for those small gifts that God gives us on a day in and day out basis. The fact that we got home at the end of the workday, when you think about it, is a pretty amazing gift. The fact that we live in such a beautiful part of the world, that we need to thank God for. The fact that we have families and friends who support us, but it's easy for us to forget to give thanks to God for those small gifts. And I think that's one thing that stewardship wants us to do, and I think through prayer we want to be doing that. I think good examples of that in the Psalms. So many of the Psalms are fantastic prayers of gratitude to God, and I think it would do us well to help encourage our fellow Catholics to pray the Psalms more regularly, as well as us doing it as well. And I think the more frequently we can get people to pray, the more gratefulness to God I think we will see. When I was involved with the International Catholic Stewardship Conference on their board, I was part of a committee that would review nominations for parish stewardship awards. And one thing we would frequently see is parishes that were doing really good in stewardship also were promoting things like promoting perpetual adoration or regular Eucharistic adoration. And I think there's a connection there that promoting of prayer and it was something that helped parishes to advance stewardship better amongst their parishioners. So we want to think about what can we do individually to be more grateful to God for our prayer, or through our prayer life, and how can we help our fellow parishioners do that as well? I know at home, my family and I, at the beginning of our evening prayers, tacked on at the very beginning a thank you to God for all that God has given to us that day and done for us. I try to be specific. I'm having trouble getting my kids to be specific as we do that prayer, but I think it helps us to recall at the very beginning of our prayers to be grateful to God, and that God did do a lot of good things for us during every day. Okay, so first element, receive God's gifts gratefully, connect to prayer. Second element, cultivate our gifts. And I connect that with this whole idea of formation. And I came to that. I think this is the most difficult element to think about. How do we practically cultivate our gifts? And I came to this through two ways. One, when my son first started taking piano lessons. And he actually had a pretty good talent for the piano. But how did he get better at it? He cultivated that gift by practicing and learning more about how to play the piano. And I think we could even connect that, for instance, with farmers and agriculture. I'm not a farmer, never lived on a farm, but I suspect one thing to being a good cultivator, a good farmer, is to regularly learn better about how to better cultivate one's crops and take care of one's land. And so I think connecting cultivating our gifts to formation and education is a good way for us to live out that stewardship life. And so obviously we need to discern our gifts. What gifts do we have? We have an enormous number of gifts, but where do our talents lie? What special gifts has God given us? Each of us is unique. God's created us uniquely. What gifts do you have that you could kind of bring to the fore and cultivate more? One good example, or one good paradigm for seeing this was developed by Bishop Robert Morneau of Green Bay, Wisconsin, and he came up with something he called the 12 Gardens of Stewardship. And so his idea of the 12 Gardens of Stewardship was that stewardship is something that permeates all our lives. It isn't just something we do on Sunday at church, but the way we live our lives. So he talked about the garden of the body, the garden of relationships, the garden of the planet, the garden of decisions, the garden of the emotional life, the garden of technology, the garden of history, the garden of the mind, the garden of the soul. And so I think if we took that structure and looked at how can we cultivate the gifts that we have, how can we help our people look at those gifts and understand how to use those gifts better. So for instance, technology I think is a good one. Technology is certainly a gift from God, but a gift that can easily be used in negative ways, right? I mean, each of us can think of ways that we can use, or that technology can be used in ways that draw us away from God. But Bishop Morneau was talking about how could we use technology to benefit the world, to build up the world? How can we help bring people closer to God through that? So I think this idea of how do we cultivate those gifts is a key one, by learning how to use those gifts better. We'll talk about that more, this concept more, when we talk about what structurally as parishes can do. The third element of stewardship, we share our gifts in love and justice with others. And I really connect this with the giving that we do beyond our church. Now, the pastoral letter itself talks about the fact that stewardship isn't just meant to be something internal to us as Catholics that we just do at church, but also something that's meant to affect the wider world. How can we make the wider world a better place? I think, it connects with Pope Francis's call to go out as well. And so how do we share our gifts in love and justice with others, with the wider world? We do that through getting involved, I think, in our own local communities. Some people go even further, far and wide beyond that. One thing we can do as a practical matter is all those very special collections that we have. So often we see those special collections for the domestic church or for the universal church as kind of almost annoyances or nuisances that we have to do several times a year. But I think if we see those as opportunities to be good stewards, as opportunities to share our gifts in love and justice with others, all of a sudden those become more meaningful. And I think it's important for us to make sure that we let our people know that sharing our gifts in love and justice beyond the church is an important way of being a good steward. Then the final element of this idea of receiving God's gifts gratefully, cultivating them, sharing them in love and justice, is returning to the Lord. And this is where I think we get to the maybe classic might not be the right word, but the kind of common understanding, perhaps erroneous understanding of what stewardship is. And if we see the church as the Lord's instrument on earth, this is where I think we begin to talk about that giving that we want people to do to support the church, whether it's through volunteering or giving financially to the church. And so if we do that, it's something that we can see as a part of our practice of stewardship is building up our stewardship. Someone recently said, Thanksgiving is important, but there are two parts to Thanksgiving, thanks and giving. And so we've got to make sure that we don't just take the potentially the easiest part of that to thank, but also to carry out the giving aspect of Thanksgiving. That we need to be joyful in our giving. So there are some elements to returning our gifts to the Lord, returning our gifts to the church that are crucial to keep in mind. And you've probably heard these as probably as parish leaders, that our gift to God, our gift to the church should be planned, something we think about ahead of time, that we consider, not something that just happens as a collection basket is coming down the row, or as someone is getting up there at the announcements saying, man, we really need more people to help us out at coffee and donuts, but instead we evaluate where could I put my gifts to use. So our gifts should be planned, our gifts should be proportionate. So if we're especially blessed that we give our gifts in greater proportion than others who might not be. And I think that kind of goes in different ways for people. So I see so many retired people in my parish who are generous givers of their time to the parish because they have been blessed with proportionally more time than the rest of us. And obviously that applies on the financial side too. If we're especially blessed financially, the hope is we will share our gifts more in a proportionate way as well. So planned, proportionate, sacrificial. A gift that is something that impacts us. It isn't just something that we don't notice. It's a little left over what I have at the end of the week, but a gift that requires a certain amount of sacrifice on my part, that I'm giving up something to grow closer to the Lord. I'm giving up something to return to the Lord. And finally, that the gift should be thankful, as I pointed out. That we're, through our giving back to the church, we're being thankful. And I'm guessing most of us who are listening today, or this evening, have gotten pretty good at this. And this is the area, I think, where most of our parishes have focused. But I think a lot of our parishes have stagnated because this is the only area of stewardship they focused on. And so I think if we're really to bring this message of stewardship further and in greater depth to our people, we need to look at those other elements of stewardship as well. Not that we want to ignore this, but it's important to do that. What does all this mean in terms of these four elements of stewardship that we receive God's gifts gratefully, that we cultivate them responsibly, that we share them in love and justice, that we return them to the Lord. What I think it means for us as parish leaders and diocesan leaders is that we look at how can we help our parishes work on each of those aspects of stewardship, of that stewardship message, of how we live our lives of stewardship. And we'll talk about ideas for doing that here in a bit. So Archbishop Murphy said, and others may have said as well, that stewardship is not a program, but it is a process. My apologies for if I'm mispronouncing process, right? And that's true for individuals as well as parishes. So the challenge for many parishes is how to avoid making stewardship a program. And the way to do that is by looking at all those aspects of stewardship. And that process is important to help people grow in this life of stewardship. I can remember how this happened to me. That I remember in the mid-90s, I was going through a difficult time financially. And I didn't understand why that was happening. I was frustrated about it. But fortunately, I'd heard the message of stewardship prior to that, and ultimately God was able to work in my heart to help me put those hard times in the context of stewardship. And I was able to become, I think I became a more grateful person for the gifts that God had given me, and helped to move me away from being a more envious person because of the things I didn't have. And so I think that helped as well. Another part of that process is when I became a parent. And those of you that are parents, I think probably had your eyes open too in terms of this great gift of children that God gave you. And children aren't just for us, obviously. You see that we're called to raise our children to be the people that God wants us to be, and that's an enormous stewardship responsibility, right? We're called to be stewards of our children. And then I also, that process also occurred to me when my father passed away about 4 years ago, and that helped me to realize what a great steward he was and how I needed to take steps to better imitate the good life that he led and how he grew closer to God. So that was certainly something that, those are, I think, examples of processes that we go through individually. As individuals, then, I think that process for us personally involves cultivating gratefulness, as we talked about, the constant appreciation of what we have, to give thanksgiving, the frequent expression of gratitude to God, and then also that generosity as well. So it isn't enough for us just to cultivate gratefulness or to give thanksgiving, but also to take action based on that and be generous as well. For parishes, a similar process, but as parish leaders, we need to create awareness amongst our people about the need to be good stewards and how to live a life of stewardship. But it isn't enough to just create that awareness. We also need to challenge them to do that. And that may be the hardest part for us to do, because it's not always easy to let our people know that they need to take steps to become better stewards and to live the life that God is calling them to. And then after that, we don't want to just challenge them and leave it at that. We want to also give them encouragement for how to carry out those steps of stewardship. How do we help them along that road to stewardship? We'll discuss some specific strategies for doing this in the next part of the presentation, but I think one thing to keep in mind is this life of stewardship, the stewardship process, is really a never-ending process, and there's some important reasons for that. I've run into pastors and parish leaders who say, I've been at this for 3 or 4 years now, we've talked about it a lot, I'm going to move on to something else. But we can't do that, and I think there's good reasons why we can't do that. If we think about stewardship as an integral message of our faith and of the Gospels, and of what we talk about and what we hear at church, at Mass every week, that's kind of absurd because, we don't stop reading the reading. We don't read the readings just once during our life, right? They're in a 3-year cycle. And I think that's important, just like this message of stewardship, because for each person, 3 years on, a year on, 5 years on, we're going to hear that message differently than we heard it 1 year or 3 years or 5 years before. We're going to be at a different place in our lives. There are people who don't hear the message of stewardship initially or don't take it to heart for some reason, but years later, when they hear it again, all of a sudden there's something in their lives that enables it to touch their heart. So we don't want to take this message of stewardship, talk about it once, and then go, okay, that's it, we did stewardship, now we're moving on to something different. So I think, as challenging as that may be, for us to realize we're always going to be talking about this message of stewardship, it's something that's just part of reality, that because people are at different points in their lives, or sometimes they're ready to hear the message, and sometimes they're not, that it's always a process that's going to have to continue to go on year in and year out, just like any other message we share through that come to us from the Gospels. Discipleship, the need to be prayerful, all those. We wouldn't stop talking about the need to be good disciples, or the need to be prayerful, or the need to walk further with Jesus, just because we've said that message once. We're going to be constantly doing that. And so I think as parish leaders, that's one thing you need to be mindful of, is every year, or on not just every year, but on a regular basis, we need to continue to bring this message of stewardship to our parishioners and to our fellow Catholic people. So here in just a minute, we'll move on to the next part of the presentation. I don't know if it's appropriate. Oh my gosh, we were only scheduled late. So why don't we do that, and I'll take questions afterwards. So I know some people, I want to be respectful of people who were only expecting for this to go from 7 to 8. So if we could bring up the next presentation, this one will be more practical. What kind of practical things can we do as parish leaders to implement parish stewardship in our parish? And the advice I'll give you comes from, of course, not only my 22 years of working in, 19 years of working in parish stewardship at the Archdiocese of Seattle, but being involved in stewardship in my own parish for many years, watching other parishes and learning from parishes throughout the world. I apologize if some of this information is information that you've already implemented in your parish, but again, I want to make sure these ideas get out there. One thing I would mention, though, is people often come to me and say, what is a stewardship parish? Well, what do I have to do to be a stewardship parish? And I'd say the one thing that I think is probably sets stewardship parishes apart from other parishes is you could expect to walk into that church on any given weekend and hear or see some reference to stewardship. It might not happen every weekend, but it isn't only going to happen. You aren't only going to hear about stewardship when the parish is ready to ask you for money or to volunteer, but instead that you might hear, or probably would hear, about stewardship just about any weekend that you come into that church. So if that's the kind of church you are, if that's the kind of parish you are, then I think you probably are a stewardship parish, making good progress to being a stewardship parish. If the only time your people hear stewardship is when you're asking them to give money or to volunteer, then that's probably only the beginning of the road to stewardship. So, first of all, in terms of parish stewardship, in implementing this, I think there's some structure every parish needs to have in place. And again, I apologize if some of this is redundant, but the first thing I talk about is some kind of parish census software. And why is this so crucial? Because if you aren't able to keep track of your parishioners, it's going to be hard to get the message of stewardship or any other message to your parishioners on a regular basis. Because in this day and age, we need to be getting the messages to our parishioners, not just at Sunday Mass, but throughout the week, via email, social media, sometimes via regular mail. I remember about 15 years ago, there were a group of folks who came from the Diocese of Wollongong in Australia, just south of Sydney, a suburban Sydney diocese. And I was showing them around the diocese, having them meet with different parishes that were really good, that I felt were really good stewardship parishes. And throughout the week, there seemed to be some disconnect in terms of, they hear about these great ideas, and yet they seem somewhat daunted by the task of having to move forward with those ideas. What I found out was, at least in their part of Australia, they didn't keep registration lists of who their parishioners were. There was no mailing list. The only way to communicate with their parishioners was at Sunday Mass. And so a lot of these good ideas that would help get the message of stewardship to their parishioners were awfully hard to get out there because, I suspect since your parishes are somewhat smaller than other parishes, it might be easier. But most parishes I know, the average Catholic is there at Mass once a month, right? Many of them there every week, but the average person only comes once every 3 or 4 weeks. So we're going to miss a lot of people with messages we need to get to them if the only thing we rely on is when we talk about stewardship or any other message at Mass. So I think every parish needs some kind of census software so you can communicate with your parishioners on a regular basis, even if they miss Mass some weekend or if they're rarely at Mass, because even if they're only at Mass once a month, at least they've shown some interest in being part of our parish. We still need to be communicating with them, and they probably are still willing to support our parish and live out their lives as stewards. But the second thing is a consultative commitment, a commitment on the part of our consultative bodies, pastoral councils, finance councils, to regularly look at stewardship. Now, for those of you that are good-sized parishes, you may want to even look at something like a stewardship commission or stewardship committee that focuses on stewardship exclusively and then works with the pastoral council and the other consultative bodies and the staff and the pastor. If you're a smaller parish, I would recommend that your pastoral council every month have stewardship be one of the agenda items so that you could talk about regularly how are we advancing stewardship in this parish. There also is sometimes some tension between a pastoral council and a finance council about stewardship. Obviously, finance councils are very interested in making sure that the parish is well supported financially. What I tell parishes is that the finance council should be concerned with how are they good stewards of the resources of the parish. The pastoral council or a stewardship commission should be concerned with how do we help our parishioners be better stewards of the gifts that God has given them. So I think that might be a good way to divide that so you don't end up with finance council and pastoral council going, no, this is my job or this is my responsibility. The next one is the personal commitment of parish leadership. And if you're going to do anything in a parish, including stewardship, the parish leadership needs to be committed to this. And they need to be givers financially. They need to be volunteers, at least volunteering somewhat if they're busy, or at least giving a little financially, even if they're not all that well off. But parish leaders especially need to have skin in the game when it comes to stewardship. And that is also true when you ask people to sign up to volunteer or pledge to give financially. Every parish leader should be returning a commitment card to volunteer and to give financially, because it's hard for parish leaders then to convincingly spread that message of stewardship beyond themselves to the rest of the parish. And then the final thing in terms of structure is the need to allocate staff time to support stewardship. And I know some of your parishes are rather small, so there is you couldn't allocate a lot of staff time to it, but I think it's important that someone on parish staff has responsibility in their job description for stewardship, and describe what that is. Whether it's making sure that the commitment renewals are part of that person's job, whether it's making sure that there's a weekly blurb in the bulletin on stewardship or a monthly bulletin insert, that there's something in that somebody on parish staff has responsibility for stewardship, at least as part of their job description. Now let's go into a focus of of three areas that I think you can structurally look at in terms of how you bring this message of stewardship, or where you focus on for bringing that message. So the first thing is awareness. So there are three parts. Awareness, it kind of lines up with the previous slide. Awareness, you need to make parishioners aware. Challenge, you need to challenge them, and encourage. So those three parts of the structure. The first one is awareness. And first thing I would suggest, and this obviously is going to fall on you priests and your deacons, is the need to preach about stewardship. There's the importance of helping people understand what stewardship is and how to live as a stewardship. And so I think it's important to regularly preach about stewardship. And again, not just when you're going to be asking people to volunteer or give money, but throughout the year. And I think the pastoral letters are rich resources for finding messages to preach about stewardship. If you haven't read them, I'd really encourage you to, because I think you're going to find ways to connect stewardship to preaching throughout the year. Not every week, but on a regular basis. A classic one I think about is the readings where Jesus talks about marriage. Well, a good opportunity for you to preach about how husbands and wives need to be good stewards of their marriage. And I think that would help to open people's eyes about how the many varied ways that people can be good stewards. And so I would encourage you to get those pastoral letters and use those as resources for preaching about stewardship. The next thing for increasing awareness is info about stewardship in parish media. And obviously the bulletin, you want to make sure there's something in your bulletin about stewardship. And as Bishop Jensen mentioned, ICSC has material on their website you can access. If you Google it, I'm sure there are many parishes, and especially dioceses, that put resources about stewardship on. I haven't looked at your diocese website or Vancouver, but looking at Edmonton, I know they have many resources about stewardship on their website. Certainly Seattle does as well, and you're always welcome to take any of that. In terms of parish media, also you want to be looking at if you have a parish newsletter, I think a good opportunity for telling witness stories. Can you have someone in your parish who share their story about why they decided to become good stewards? Was it the example of their parents? Was it the birth of a child that prompted them to do that? And certainly on your parish website as well, if you use social media, email, an important way to always include a message about stewardship in there. And again, those resources are there so that you don't have to create them from scratch, so that your staff don't have to create them from scratch. Then finally, formation is when take opportunities to educate your parishioners about stewardship outside of Mass. Certainly your young people. There are some good resources out there for working the message of stewardship into faith formation and religious ed for young people, but also for adults as well. And I think that's where Bishop Morneau's 12 Gardens of Stewardship can again connect with our how to practically live or bring stewardship to your parishes. How can you share ideas about how to be a good steward of the arts or your mind or what have you in your parish? An important thing about awareness is to remember that we're competing with all those messages out there in the wider world. If the only time your parishioners hear about the message of stewardship or any faith message is when they show up at church on Sunday, man, we're going to really lose that battle against all the messages they see in the wider world, whether it's driving down the road or watching TV or on their smartphones. So I think it's incumbent on Catholic parishes to get messages, including messages about stewardship, out there every way they can, and not just at Mass on Sunday. The next one, challenge. Obviously, we want to make our parishioners aware of stewardship. How do we challenge them then to live that life of stewardship? The first thing is probably the most obvious, commitment renewals. Every year, you should be asking your parishioners to consider and to put in writing how they are going to give financially, how they're going to give their time, and even how they're going to maybe improve their prayer life. Ideally, they would be putting that in writing and giving that to the parish. Certainly, you need to know if they're going to volunteer, right? It's ideal for you to know what they're goal is for giving financially, because that enables both those things, and by knowing those, you are able to help them by gently reminding them that, Mrs. Smith, we appreciate your giving to the parish. Last November, you said you were going to you pledged $10 a week. It's June, you've given $230. If you're able, a gift of $30 would catch you up for this year. So, and most people, believe it or not, most people respond quite well to that, and I'll talk about that more in detail here in just a minute. But so commitment renewals. It's important to ask people, if possible, to put in writing what they intend to give each year to the parish financially and how they intend to volunteer. The next thing is to deal with objections to stewardship, and I think we do that in a couple of ways. We help people by deal with the busyness, the reluctance, and the fearfulness that they have in committing to anything. And that's a challenge. I think most people aren't reluctant or fearful or busy and let that get in the way of giving to the parish. They're reluctant and busy and fearful to make a commitment to anything. I mean, many of you have probably experienced the decline in sports leagues. There was a famous book about 20 years ago that you probably heard of, Bowling Alone, where the massive decline in bowling leagues, not because people don't like bowling, but because they're reluctant to commit to doing anything. Maybe another opportunity will come along, or they're busy, what have you. And so, I think we need to help them get over those obstacles of busyness and reluctance and fearfulness and other opportunities. And there are ways to do that. I mean, certainly when it comes to commitments, I mean, it's filling out a pledge card is not a legally binding commitment. We can tell people, we're just asking for your best efforts. What are your best intentions? If something comes up, we understand we're going to work with you on that. It's also important that we set expectations, though. I tell people that the church is probably the only entity that is reluctant to communicate what your expectation is of people. And that's one reason why I think mass attendance has gone down. I think there have been some surveys that young people don't really know that the Catholic Church asks them to be at Mass every week. Believe it or not. I mean, all of us probably find that astounding, but I think that's really true. There's just that impression that they just haven't been told that, and so I think it's important for us to communicate our expectations, not our requirements. We're not going to beat anybody up because they don't, but if we don't communicate expectations that people will be at Mass, that they'll give to support the church, that they'll volunteer, that people won't do that. And certainly those of you that have kids, I think would identify with that. If you don't communicate your expectations to your children, they're not going to do it. And I think that's true with plenty of adults too, as well. And I think in terms of dealing with objections, I think it's also important to use analogies that we help people to understand that there are these challenges in life as well. That we're also reluctant to commit to exercise, even though we know it's good for us. At least most of us are. I know I am. That we're reluctant to that we will willingly put our sign up for multi-year mortgages. So if you're willing to do that and God is the center of your life, why aren't you willing to sign up for a one-year pledge to give $10 a week or $20 a week or $100 a week to the church? That people will say, I'm not going to give to the church because I don't agree with this or that thing about the church. Well, I don't agree with everything my spouse does, and I'm betting those of you that are married you and your spouses don't agree on 100% of things either, but you're still generous to your spouses, right? You still give them Christmas gifts and birthday gifts and treat them well. Same thing applies to the church. If we expect we're going to agree with something 100% of the time before we're going to support them or give financially, it's never going to happen, and we're never going to get married, and we're never going to commit to anything. So I think it's important to use analogies to deal with objections. We talked about communicating expectations. That's important. Again, I think we need to do that, and the church has been somewhat reluctant to do that because we don't want to be seen as heavy-handed. But I think if we communicate those expectations, people tend to strive to fulfill those expectations, even if they don't always do that. But at least they strive for it. If we don't communicate the expectations, they're not even going to, many people aren't even going to make that effort. We got to make sure people know what those expectations are. And so some parishes actually have done a contract sort of with their parishioners where they're saying, here's what you can expect from us, from the parish, and here's what we expect the parishioners will do as part of members of the body of Christ at St. Alexander's Parish. So I could share examples or help you find examples of those if you want, but again, that expectations thing. And then also, I think the other thing we need to challenge people to do is to be generous beyond the parish as well. So again, connecting to that idea that stewardship isn't just at the parish level, but it's something we need to remind them to do to help live out that discipleship. Finally, the last part is parishes need to encourage their parishioners. And the first thing are some practical things that we need to thank our parishioners on a regular basis for their support of the parish and for being good stewards. We need to help them with providing them with prayers of gratitude, I think. I've heard of a parish that will reprint or make accessible the psalm for the week, or psalm from Sunday Mass in the bulletin, so people can encourage people to pray that psalm at home, especially if it's a psalm of gratitude. Quarterly, so there's a good example. I don't know if any of you have heard of the idea of sending out a quarterly letter to your parishioners, reminding them of what they promised. First of all, thanking them, but also for their volunteer and their financial giving, but also reminding them of what they said they would do. And again, that's a good example of those analogies. I mean, if those reminders are important in all our life, it isn't just here that people need reminders, but I need a reminder from my mom to call my sisters who are spread throughout the country. If she doesn't remind me to do that, I may call them on their birthday and Christmas, and that's it. But I need those reminders, and I do it. And I'm grateful for those reminders. And I, of course, need those reminders from my wife to exercise, which I would otherwise not do if she didn't remind me. But the idea of quarterly is that we would remind our parishioners maybe 4 times a year about what they committed to. And our experience in the Archdiocese of Seattle was when we did those quarterlies for parishes, that most people, not well over 90%, would step up to the plate and go, oh, that's right, I did mean to give $10 a week to the parish. And, I started doing that in January and February, and then I kind of got forgot. And, the soccer season started in the spring, and I didn't make it to Mass as often. But they do catch up. I mean, we've seen the parishes that do these quarterlies get well over 90% of the amount that is pledged to the parish by those people who make pledges, whereas those that don't do quarterly reminders only get about 65% of the amount that's pledged to the parish. And after they do it once, they get very few complaints about it. So they'll get a handful of complaints the first time they do it. Why are you reminding me? This is between me and God. Okay, fine. We won't send you those reminders. No problem. But after that, we have parishes who, when they don't send out the quarterly now, but they got busy or forgot, they get calls from their parishioners asking, "Where's my quarterly letter?" Because they want to keep track of their own giving. So I know there are parishes that are fearful of this, but it's a good way to help keep people on track with parish stewardship. Next one is, I think it's important to recognize parishioners who step up to the plate for stewardship. We think nothing of thanking people in the bulletin who maybe helped out with the parish dinner, right? We may think nothing of thanking people in the bulletin who pledged to the parish capital campaign. In the same way, I think it's important to recognize people who return pledge cards to volunteer or to give financially. We have parishes who every year when they're doing their commitment renewals will do a thank you insert in the bulletin listing the names of all the families who returned a card, even if it says 0 or can't volunteer at this time or something like that. And that regularly encourages other people to get those pledge cards in. So I think it's important to recognize the good work that people will do in terms of making a commitment. And the final thing then is a parish annual report. And I think it's important for parishes to give annual reports out for transparency reasons, and also to encourage parishioners about the exciting things the parish does every year. So if we don't tell our parishioners about the exciting things we do with the time and the money they give us, they're going to think it's just going into a dark black hole somewhere. We need to be telling them about the exciting things we're doing. We sent, as a result of your giving, we sent 12 youth to the youth convention, or we helped 150 people last month who came to the parish food bank, or what have you. We need to tell people about the good things we do, and a parish annual report is a good way to do that. So a good way to structurally help people, to encourage people to stay on the path of stewardship. So anyhow, with that, I know I've gone over time a little bit here, but so to wrap up, again, the message of stewardship is important. It's a good message. It's consistent with our faith. It's one that will help people live their lives better and grow closer to God. It's beneficial to them as well as to our parishes and our church as a whole. And so I would encourage you, as parish leaders, to take some time in the next few weeks and decide maybe in each one of these areas, awareness, challenge, encourage, maybe pick one thing for your parish to do this coming year to move forward in stewardship, to help your people grow in stewardship this coming year. I'm happy to stay around for questions and however you'd like to work it. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Tomorrow, all the priests will be spending the day with Scott, so I'm looking forward to all the good things that will happen there. Church is a body, and we help each other, and it's wonderful that someone from the church in another diocese can come here and enrich us with their own experience and give us the hope that we can do good things here as well. So thank you, Scott, and thank you to those who are watching online. Will the online continue? Or is it?
I can keep it going if there's questions. Or
okay. We have a few questions, so maybe I'll bring the microphone to those people.
I did have a comment though. You
Sure.
mentioned at the beginning of your talk about some of the parishes or maybe some of the dioceses that had great success with their stewardship programs. One of them was perpetual adoration.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Could you elaborate or show an example of one of those parishes or dioceses maybe?
Sure. I think with perpetual adoration, it tended to be bigger parishes because obviously you need a significant number of people. They would actually get the bishop's permission to create a perpetual adoration chapel typically because obviously need for security of the Blessed Sacrament. And that they would ask people to volunteer for 1 hour a week to be part of perpetual adoration. And I think the value in that was it helped people to connect prayer with a life of stewardship. And so it was just something that was, I don't know, I can't say that there was a direct correlation, but it was something that was very common that I would see amongst these parishes that were submitting themselves to be recognized for stewardship and were doing great things in other areas of stewardship, that so many of them also had either perpetual adoration, or if they were smaller, they focused more deeply on Eucharistic adoration and as part of their stewardship effort. It was the idea of, we hear this alliteration of time, talent, and treasure. If treasure obviously was money, talent was volunteering, and time was prayer, it was a way to encourage people to step up and be more prayerful.
Pope Paul VI, in one of his letters, said that the church exists to evangelize. So I'm just curious, in your experience, what level of importance does our mission to evangelize and share the charisma to non-Catholics have in our call to stewardship?
Yeah, very, very good point. I think that's, I think the importance of evangelizing connects with the idea that if we see our faith as a gift from God, and stewardship calls us to share our faith, then evangelization is right along with stewardship. And I don't think it's any accident that the increased emphasis on evangelization in the church arose about the same time that the increased emphasis on stewardship did as well. And so certainly evangelization is key, and I often run into parishes who have been working hard on stewardship and helping their parishioners and encouraging them to be better stewards, and really feel like they've hit a wall. And what we found out typically is that the next step is getting more people to church, whether it's Catholics who aren't coming, who've fallen away, or just the wider community as well, that they've really done a good job in encouraging the parishioners who are coming to Mass. But the next frontier for them is really that emphasis on evangelization. So I think they go hand in hand in many ways. And in terms of the practical ways to do that, there are resources in other dioceses that have really promoted evangelization along with stewardship as well. So,
Last year, we had about the refugees.
Oops, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
For the folks on.
We had the idea of welcoming refugees to our
Right.
town. So maybe the idea came from our parish, local parish. But the idea went over the parish, the whole town were rallied around, like a stewardship.
Yeah.
You know, all the other churches in the town, mayor, everybody, and we raised a lot of money for the refugees. So it is not just our church alone. Of course, the idea came from a few people from our church, but we went around. Finally it was a big success in the little town of Fraser Lake.
Yeah, excellent idea of how we can be stewards of the wider world, and I think that went hand in hand with the stewardship message and Pope Francis's message to really be out there in the world. So, wow, great example, Father, of how that worked.
We raised money too.
Yeah, very good. Wow, amazing example of how the church can be leaders in our world as well. So. Any questions online? Okay.
All right, thank you very much, and thanks for coming. And we hope that this is the beginning of a more focused attempt in the diocese to do the things that Scott talked about, to raise the awareness, to encourage people, to challenge them, and to build a culture of stewardship, not only for our own community, but to make the church flourish and reach out to those who are waiting to hear about God's goodness and waiting for the opportunity to return his gifts too. So thank you, and to everybody online, good night, and thanks for coming here.
Thank you.